Welcome back, everybody, to the Longevity Lab. I'm your host, Juliette Root,
And I'm Mackie Root.
and today we have a very special guest, Matt Lyon, a healer extraordinaire. In addition to becoming a chiropractor, he earned his master's degree in acupuncture and Chinese medicine. He has also completed thousands of hours of advanced postgraduate training in applied kinesiology, energy kinesiology, quantum neuro reset therapy, and trauma-informed chiropractics. Throughout his career, he has supported Olympic athletes, literal rock stars, pro athletes, politicians, families, kids, and people simply aspiring to evolve, to grow, and get better. Matt shares that he will help you discover the constellation of your own personal healing codes and patterns that need to be activated and reorganized in order to catalyze your body's natural ability to heal itself.
Wow.
Woo, baby. Who am I sitting with right now?
Who am I sitting with?
Isn't it funny writing like your bios or putting
know.
things together?
It
Because
is funny.
I mean, this is you. This is what you've accomplished over the years. I mean,
Mhm.
how many years have you been doing what you do?
I consider like 2001 was my start.
Yeah,
So that's 23 years now.
it's a long time to
Yeah.
accumulate lots of education and
Yeah.
experience.
And in that formal role, it was, 23 years. I started really young in a lot of this world, both as someone who was aspiring to go to the Olympics for luge. So I was living at the Olympic Training Center when I was in middle school,
Oh, wow.
training with these one Russian coach and other coaches. And, we were learning how to really calm your nervous system and visualize, because that's the way you would prepare to get on a small piece of metal going down a track at, 80 miles per hour or however much it was. And so that was a really big introduction to me. And then I started meditating more out of necessity because I came from a really traumatic background, which I'm sure we'll jump into. But I started early in these formalized ways. So I think that's kind of what started my journey.
Wow.
That's so interesting because when I was played baseball back in the late 90s and Mark McGwire was hitting 70 home
I
runs.
love Mark McGwire.
Yeah. But they talked about how he was doing visualizations in the
right.
on-deck circle before he would go up and bat. So I was like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. He hit 70 home runs. It worked for him. And that was sort of my introduction to it as well. It's really, really cool.
Yeah. I think sport can be a real, aperture into the mind-body space.
Yeah.
For sure.
Do you have to be an adrenaline junkie to get on a metal tube like that? And
I think so.
down?
I think so. Here's a perspective that I take is that most people are doing the behaviors that they're doing to try to make their brain feel better. So it's a really compassionate way to look at behavior. For me, I thrived on adrenaline and dopamine because a lot of my baseline, I felt very depressed. I felt very sad. I was very anxious, right? So those things really not only gave me a psychological sense of agency, but also they were very kind of like that unplugged my inner pharmacy so that the molecules of, adrenaline and norepinephrine and dopamine could sort of lock in. And that was my baseline at that time in my life, how I felt normal.
So how did you go from that? You said you were doing that in middle school.
Yeah.
So tell me more about your origin story into becoming someone who helps people with healing.
Yeah. I mean, really succinctly, and, we can unpack this as much as you want. So my family was a really interesting constellation of trauma. And my dad was a Vietnam vet. He did 2 tours in Vietnam, and he came from a very traumatic lineage, and his father had committed suicide. So just from an intergenerational trauma perspective, he's packed full of genes, ready to be in constant fight or flight. And then, that's just sort of the world I was born into. My mom's family was similar. And my sister died before I was born. So that milieu of my mother's womb was sort of like, wow, we've just lost a child in really tragic circumstances. So I would have been primed just already to be on edge and not feel safe. So I loved athletics. I loved sport. It was something that I had a natural proclivity for, but it also helped me feel good and part of and connected. And I was so grateful for that time. So when I was at the Olympic Training Center, though, my parents were going through a lot of trouble and they were getting divorced. And I could not, my head was not in the game. I was not in my body, as the saying goes. And when you're doing those kinds of sports, you don't have much margin
Mm.
to not be in your body. And I'll never forget, I was sliding down and the sled started to get out of control. And it happened really quick. And I heard this inner voice. It was like a scream inside my head. And it said, lift up your head. So I went like this. And at that moment, the back of the sled rammed into this, concrete
Wow.
guardrail effectively of the track.
Yeah.
Crumpled up the sled. And I was like, wow, that would have been it for me. Like traumatic brain injury, quadriplegic, whatever it was. And I thought, I just can't. I don't want to do this
And you were
anymore.
how old when that was happening?
I was 13.
Oh, that's
So
really
quite
young.
young. In a lot of those sports, you're seated young, at least back then. I have no idea how it works now. This would have been in like the late 80s.
Does it help to be very light? Is that a sport?
Not necessarily, because
Or do you need to weigh the thing down a little bit?
force is mass times acceleration.
Yeah.
So a little bit more mass on people.
Yeah.
The longer body types seem to do better with that sport. It's fascinating subculture of these sled sports.
Very powerful too, right? Just the start, the big sprint at the beginning.
Yeah, that's right. Which is all an upper body kind of like
Yeah.
crazy pull.
How does one even get exposed to doing this?
I
Because
s-
I didn't, that was not even something I knew about until I was
Yeah.
an adult, that sport. Like, how do you even get exposed to doing the luge?
Right. So at that time I was growing up in Vermont, right? So there's a lot
Okay.
of snow. And at this moment, so I'm not sure, this would have been, I believe, the 1988 Olympics.
Mm.
And I watched them and I was watching those. I was like, I have to do that. So I went to the phone. At that point, we had a rotary phone, right? And I called, I looked at the area code for Lake Placid, New York, and I just called information. I was like, is there a United States Luge Association? So I just researched it.
Wow.
And then I told my mom, I was like, I'd really like to do this. And they had a seed camp in the summer. And, I think what they're doing is they're just trying to gauge who has, the right, athletic proclivity to progress in the sport. And I guess I passed that first test. And so that was sort of the beginning. But I just saw it and I was like, wow, that looks amazing. And so during that time, so then my parents were going through a really hard time. And I came back and I really sunk. And that was kind of the first time in my life where I went through what I would consider like a real depression. And so then I did kind of what was the common coping strategy in my family, was using substances to try to feel okay. So I started smoking a lot of weed. I was quite young. And, like it was just, there was no good boundaries in our family around, what's healthy behavior. It was sort of a free for all.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad, of course, was very traumatized from the war, and I'm self-medicating, and it just was a very crazy place. So I started to go downhill very quickly. Gratefully, I don't tolerate substances super easily. And I ended up doing a good bit of LSD, and it really was terrifying experience. And for about 6 months afterwards, I had extreme panic attacks. So during this time, I said, okay, this path is not going to work for me. And so there was, so I actually ended up going to 12-step meetings because that made sense to me. And I wanted a community, right? Because we all want to belong. At the same time, I found this Zen master, like a bona fide lineage holding Zen master near my town. And I just went and started learning meditation. And that was really kind of my start. So this is 16 years of age.
Wow.
And I never looked back.
It's so young to even be drawn to that world, to even be drawn to 12-step program at that age, to understand there was something, I feel like, guiding you in some way.
Well, that's a good point. The two stable influences I had in my life were my grandmothers, my
Uh-huh.
paternal and maternal grandmother. My dad's mom, she had been an alcoholic. She got sober. So she spent her life helping addicts and alcoholics change their lives. She was awesome. And she started taking me to meetings when I was really young. So gratefully, I had exposure. And then my grandmother on the other side, she was more traditional Southern. She was from Alabama, but she was also like a feminist. She like bucked the patriarchal system, and she was really involved with her church, but her expression of that ideology or virtue was service to others. So I just remember driving around town with her, bringing meals to the poor, and like she was just love in action. Both of my grandmothers were. So they planted a lot of seeds for me,
Got it.
as did those early coaches. as did my training in the martial arts, which I got into right around that same age, 16. So I just had a lot of family by choice. And I craved people who seemed stable. So they're sort of like left breadcrumbs to follow a path whereby I could start to train my mind to be balanced and to heal. I mean, effectively of substantial trauma, which then sort of lit a fire inside of me that I wanted to do that for others. And so, not a couple years later, like a year later, I went to a chiropractor. I was like, oh my God, this is what I want to do with my life. Because they just thought outside the box. Well, Martha,
Yes, we have a little sage cat that comes in.
yeah, so they thought outside the box and were these really just, and again, this is like in the 90s. So it's not like we had access to, the accoutrements of healing that you have here in Boulder or any other place like this. But they were amazing. And I felt the shift and I said, there's something here. And then I loved Chinese medicine. So that's really the origin story of it all.
Yeah. I think for most people, when they think of chiropractic, they just think of spinal adjustments.
Cracks.
Cracks, yes, back cracks. And that was, my understanding of it when the first time I ever saw a chiropractor was just that I was just getting adjustments, like physical adjustments that had nothing really to do with emotional health or mental health or anything. So I'm curious if you could explain it a little bit more, because I know there's so much more to chiropractics, and also it gets a bad reputation.
It sure does.
Like a
It
lot
has-
of physical therapists will shit on chiropractics
Yeah.
and different people, and I always wondered, why is that? Why does there seem to be this like beef between different modalities in that way?
That's a good question. There is. Yeah, chiropractic is fascinating. I mean, for a lot of people, it has what we would call a negative brand association.
Yeah.
It has a certain brand to it. I mean, I can speak at length about it, but I'll just keep it super simple. The origin of chiropractic was actually quite cool. There was a dude in Iowa in the late 1800s, and he was a healer. He was into electromagnetic healing. He was a magnetic healer. And ironically, right across the river from him was another guy who was into healing, who would really become the founder of osteopathy and what we now know as cranial sacral work. So it's kind of interesting. You're in the late 1800s, and there's emergence of these alternative methods of healing. In Germany, before that, we had homeopathy developing. Obviously, Chinese medicine has been around for thousands of years, but there was this unique form of alternative healing that was emerging. And chiropractic's idea was to remove stress from the system so that we could better self-regulate. And the three stressors would be physical stressors, which I guess the term was misalignments, but, just consider anything that's physically out of balance creates stress in your system. Chronic injuries, true misalignments, poor muscle function. Those are actually stressors, right? That your system has to work harder to compensate. The next stressor would have been, and think about the difference now in our world versus then, but it was toxins. So toxic stress, which in the late 1800s, we didn't have, Monsanto. We didn't have like big pharma. We didn't have processed foods.
Would that be more considered like bacteria in the food at that point?
Maybe.
Just food going bad?
Anything that was not optimal for your health.
Yeah.
Pure in some way. Anything
Yeah,
that's like foreign
totally
to your body.
Yeah, so physical traumas, physical stresses, toxins, and then thoughts, which to me would be emotional stress and trauma. So it kind of makes sense. It was actually, from its origin, a very holistic model. And that's really how it emerged. The chiropractors, the original chiropractors, really put an emphasis on the nervous system as being sort of the regulator of the whole body.
Which
is
is
actually very
what's
true.
happening right now as far as like mainstream science and health,
Totally.
is that the nervous system is becoming the star of the show right now.
That's
and
right.
everything that you're seeing
That's right.
from chronic health conditions. I mean, obviously, yes, there are physical things that we are up against, like toxins, but that are impacting the nervous system. And it's how do we have nervous
Totally.
system regulation and health? So that's really
right.
interesting.
Yeah, so truth is true, and it goes through cycles of adoption and understanding. And our scientific understanding has changed a lot. That is how it started. Right around, and physiotherapy did not exist at this time,
Mm-hmm.
as it is in terms of these silos of profession where we interface with the human body to try to move them towards health. The osteopaths were similar in perspective and point of view, and they said, no, it's not the nervous system, it's the fluids, man. It's the cranial it's your cerebrospinal fluid, it's the lymphatics, it's the blood. Both of them were sort of in this idea of flow as health. Remove stresses. Body is ordained with and encoded with an ability to self-heal and self-regulate, which by and large is true. Stress louses that system up. And so both were really cool perspectives of like, let's help the body remove stress. And then, of course, as we do, people become tribal. And then, of course, these factions break off, and, professional identity and niching is now a big way in which you separate yourself in the marketplace. I think where chiropractors, unfortunately, a lot of times things go bad when we get money. I mean, I love capitalism is super cool. It seems to me in the human world like the best system we've got, but it has exposes the vulnerabilities of human nature to get greedy.
Mm-hmm.
So when chiropractors, in the 80s, there was a huge antitrust suit that was actually won by chiropractors against the American Medical Association because they were absolutely disparaging and using misinformation to color people's perceptions of chiropractors and or simply get us eradicated from the healthcare system. So as chiropractors are, they're very, individualistic type people. And they're like, no way, we're not going to do this. We're sticking to our guns. And they actually won a huge lawsuit, which was amazing because it really put us on the map and it sort of vindicated a lot of the story. What it did, though, is it also got us in the insurance system. And then when you have insurance, you have these payment systems, you get overutilization. So chiropractors are like, wait, I can tell people to come in 2 or 3 times a week and I can bill for everything. And so that's where there was this model of, hey, we help the nervous system. Okay, that's fair. And it's the spinal misalignments that block it. That's more controversial, right? Not that I don't love adjusting the spine. It has amazing power when it's done in the right way at the right time, but it just got overutilized. And then people associated us with the backcrackers who want you to come in for the rest of your life and come 3 times a week. And it sort of took this sort of original profession of great depth and a real, very positive regard for the human person to the perception of it being, geez, they're like used car salesmen.
Wow, I'm so glad that you shared this. I think this is really important to know because
Yeah.
I'm thinking about just that experience that I did have when I was 18. Yeah, with insurance and going 3 times a week for my neck,
Yeah.
20 minutes in and out.
Yeah. If
And
that.
and it was a really interesting experience because I started to feel like I was just a cog in some wheel and I wasn't really getting
That's right.
healing. Although at the time I didn't really even know anything about healing.
Yeah.
At that time I was like, okay, I think my neck is better. I don't know. I also don't think I had cervical arthritis at 18 years old from a year of a desk job, but that's what I was told.
Yeah, that's it, right? It's because fear is a big motivator for selling anything.
But this is what's scary about the medical system in general. This is what's so scary
That's
and
it.
what I see people go through the ringer with. And it's not necessarily the individual practitioner's fault. It's just the system that they're involved with and everybody's trying to take a piece and make money and take care of themselves. So at the end of the day,
That's
they're
it.
just trying to take care of their family. They're trying to leverage their wealth and have a good
Yeah.
life for themselves. And yet there are people who are being not taken care of the best.
It's easy. It's just in that system, and this is not. I mean, you'll see this in chiropractic, dentistry, physiotherapy,
Everything.
orthopedic surgery, financial planners. I mean, some people, when they don't have that really strong motivation of virtue
Mhm.
can easily get lost. And then, our ability to, have cognitive
And
dissonance
justify
and
everything.
believe our own bullshit it's a vulnerability of the human system. And, maybe just to complete that story about chiropractors, at the same time, that sort of became the more obvious thing. There have been these pockets in our tradition, in our lineage, which were just extraordinarily beautiful. And I'm so fortunate to have trained in one of them. And it was this system of applied kinesiology. And, and even the guy who started it, George Goodhart, was like, he said, here's my marketing. It's really simple. Take care of your clients and they will take care of you. Be the best in the world at what you can be and show up and love and serve with a big heart. I mean, have your business system that you need to have, but that's it. Do great work for people and focus on that. And that mentality spoke to me because it gave me a path of mastery, right? Like I could really work towards mastering something. It was very integrative in the sense that we didn't look just at, oh, you've got this x-ray, your spine is out of alignment, which by the way is very controversial. I mean, there's, plenty of traditions, even within my own, like we don't buy into that model and it doesn't match with how we understand neuroscience, right? And the pain of pain is so much more in the brain than it is in your x-ray showing one hip is out of alignment. There's no evidence.
Because there's also no perfect body.
None.
And your femur could be longer than my
Totally.
femur, and your hip
Yeah.
socket could be deeper than my hip socket.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. And so,
Who's to say like this is the perfect
Yeah.
human form?
So there's this structure orientation of structure being the supreme sort of determinant of someone's health versus a functional approach. And so applied kinesiology said, wow, muscles are this dynamic system of the body that are an organ of them in of themselves. And I think there's tons of research now looking at really muscles as being an endocrine organ, but also could be a way in which the language of muscles could guide us into what's most alive and real for that person and what they might need, as well as integrating a few pieces in that other systems hadn't, namely acupuncture, the meridian system, Chinese medicine, the 5 elements. There's a lot of value there. Nutrients, nutrition, different ways of eating. And how do you sort of code that for, like, what is a person's unique genetic code with that? How do emotions play a role? Like, where do those live inside the body? Is there a geographic location of these traumas? It is a functional thing. Are there ways in which we can help bring those up and use bottoms up or sensory-based or body-based ways to help people heal trauma? So it really started to look at these different ways, integrated cranial work. So we took the best of osteopathy and just said, wow, there's all these systems that can be unified where we can sort of try to understand the unique code of the person in front of us and then very, in a personalized way, really help them. And then, of course, too, with movement patterns and exercises. So to me, it spoke to me because it was very integrative. And was free of some of the shadow side of my profession. And that's just where I really chose to hang out. And then the other piece I studied a lot of was just some different subtle energy approaches because I was really interested in that. And I think there was a lot of really good stuff there. So I never was in that particular model, but I understand where people come from. And it's always sad because I wouldn't say it's the majority, but at least half the people who see me have had bad experiences with chiropractors.
Sure. I mean, it's the same in many professions. I mean, so many people that see me have had bad experiences with coaches and trainers and physical therapists. Physical therapy is another one that's really interesting. The model, very similar. When my first experience with physical therapy, I had a knee injury and I sat on the table and this person had 3 other people that they were also treating at the exact same time they were treating me. And they went over and they did a little of this on me and had me do a clamshell exercise, and then they walked away and
it's volume because it's patient volume.
because it's how they can make money.
It's how you monetize it.
Yeah.
You'd asked about physiotherapy, and it's just really interesting. So they didn't really come into much of a profession. It was really the polio days historically where physiotherapy started to emerge as a helpful adjunctive profession for sort of helping people to learn to move better. They too faced a lot of pressure from the powers that be. And the one thing is, I mean, the bottom line is physiotherapy is amazing. Chiropracture is amazing. Acupuncture is amazing. And I love when people just get along
Mm-hmm.
and just be the best in the world at what they're at and recognize there's value elsewhere. I think the tribal stuff came more from people jockeying for power and licensure rights, insurance reimbursement rights. Well, you guys do adjusting, but we do manipulation. Well, you do acupuncture, but we do dry needling. So we start to label things around, who's got what skill and who's what. At the end of the day, it's such a privilege to heal. And there's a human being in front of us. And whatever tools we've been blessed to learn, that's what I'm going to bring to that person 100% in this moment. And as far as all the noise about chiropractors, I find if I'm just in sync, with clients and just hear them and love them and mirror back to them what's going on. If it's a fit, it's a fit. If it's not, great. And if it's not, I'll help you get to where you need to be. So that's the world I dwell in because that feels real to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I just don't get in too much, but it is interesting, the historical perspective, isn't it?
But it's also interesting just human beings in general trying to kind of assert themselves and feel
Significant.
significant.
That's
Yeah.
right.
And I think that that's something that we find ourselves in many different areas of our life.
100%. Have you guys heard of the 6 human needs? Tony Robbins teaches a lot about this.
I don't think
It's a really cool model that we basically all as humans have 6 human needs and they drive us. And the third of those needs is the need for significance because at a baseline, and also this is an evolutionary thing, like we need to feel like we're somebody. The challenge is if we land there and that's where we live, I mean, you'll either be depressed or anxious when that doesn't happen because how often is that not going to happen?
Mhm.
A lot. The next sort of growth, the next sort of outpocketing, the emergence of that would be the need to love and be loved. And then the next growth out of there is to grow, is like really to grow and expand, whether that's biologically, psychologically, spiritually, whatever that means to people. And the highest rung in that model is to give. It's contribution, is to give. And so just most humans, and I've been there myself, like we just get stuck at that need for significance. Like I got to be somebody.
Yeah. I was stuck there the whole first
Yeah.
year we lived here.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I've gone through times where I've gotten stuck in it even when I know better.
Yeah. No,
Because I feel vulnerable and I'm scared.
Exactly.
Or I'm up against pressure and it's, well, no, look, let me do.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting, right? And by the way, the 2 needs below that are certainty. Like we need to feel safe. Like we need to know we're going to eat today.
Yes.
Like you fed me
My protes.
your protes. Like we need to know that there's not going to be shooting outside our door, like Haiti right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Nobody has any certainty. And that's tough as humans. And there's
a lot of that going on right now.
a lot of that going
here
on.
in the the uncertainties since 2020 or even before that
Absolutely.
for some people. But our world has changed a lot.
It's changed so much.
And people feel, especially if they're really tuned into the news every day and they're being bombarded in social media with just the scariness, the potential,
Yeah.
wars that we could be
Totally.
up against. And that,
These existential crises.
yes, climate crises.
And the political
Mhm.
polarization creates a milieu where people are really scared.
Mhm.
And so they want certainty. And I
Yep.
think we see that in the tribalism of American politics. I just want to be certain. And of course, in that, the neurobiology of that state is, it's your fault. Like there's such polarity built into that perspective. And it's a highly adrenalized, norepinephrine driven. So, people need certainty. The next thing they need is variety, like our nervous system.
Was certainty number one, or what was number one?
Number 1, certainty.
Number one, certainty.
Number 2 is variety. Like we need variance in our nervous system. Like we're awake, we're asleep.
Mhm.
There's different ways we need to move. There's just, we love variety of experience. And that next rung is significant. Like I've got to be a somebody. And that's what I associate with getting love, is by being a somebody, and then I can't fail. Right? That's that sort of myth. And the challenge is that when we live there, like I said, people just drop into all manner of dysfunctional behavior because then we're not connected to something that's real, that's really based in virtue, that's really the frontal cortex, we could say, or the heart,
Mhm.
or these higher endeavors. But, when you're running for your life, or you feel like the world's about to end, or we're going to go extinct in however many years, people can lose the gauge. And honestly, I think as a healer, all the techniques I do aside, meeting people where they're at, but then really being with them, being in a rapport with them, and then helping them see another point of view about what's possible. I think all great healers have that in common. They get in rapport, they get really connected, and they're able to shift a person's point of view and perspective about what's possible, about what is, to a higher order of something in their nervous system.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that everybody's behaviors that they're doing is they're trying to self-regulate in some way. Can you touch on that a little bit more in your experience with working with people and maybe give an example of that? And you have so many great examples with clients. I love hearing all of your stories. Anyone
Yeah.
you can think of that's was self-regulating to so they could feel normal.
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, I can only speak for myself and I don't want to paint with too wide of a brush, but we all do that.
Yeah.
And so I think a really good example, maybe I'll just speak some general examples and we can drill down to some. I love people's stories. I love people and I love their stories. And especially when, it's a hero's journey, right? Because all great stories are basically this journey of, whoa, I've just gotten my ass kicked and I'm down for the count. Like, how do I get through this? I mean, any great movie, any great story, that's what inspires us, right? There's this really interesting thing called the Braverman Index. You can look it up. You can take the test. It was developed by a psychiatrist trying to understand how I'm not a psychiatrist, I don't prescribe medication, how people could better prescribe psychiatric medication. Because that world is fraught with error. And a lot of those medicines don't work for the reason we thought they worked, which maybe we can touch on that later. But the idea is that you could sort of categorize people based on their neurotransmitter types, right? So some people are really high acetylcholine type, some people are really high serotonin type, some people are high everywhere, some people are low everywhere. So this idea that I had came from my mentor, John Bandy, who's just like this epic healer. If you're ever in Austin, Texas, look up John Bandy. And he taught me this. And he had worked on Lance Armstrong back in the day and worked on a lot of really big name athletes. And he was the one who said this to me one day. He said, Matt, he's got this really cool Southern Texas accent, which I won't try to do, but he's like, people do the things they do to try to make their brain feel better. So a good example he used was a big wave surfer, and I'll leave his name out. But this big wave surfer was someone who is very low adrenaline, low epinephrine, low dopamine, low serotonin. So their baseline state, based on probably trauma and genetics, is that. And here you're talking about someone who's, is probably either wealthy in money, or at least they get to live in cool places and have these epic experiences, to baseline feeling like, I'm kind of disconnected if I'm not doing my thing. So as soon as this particular person knew that these big waves were coming in, their brain would shift. So what's happening? They're already in an anticipatory rush of adrenaline and dopamine, and that's when this particular person felt normal. And I can relate to that.
Mhm.
Less so now because I've done, so much work and so much trauma healing and really try to take care of myself. But that was me, right? And so it wasn't until these big waves came in where you really could easily die. That was the extreme this person needed to go to feel okay in their brain. Now, it's cool. It's actually really cool stuff when we celebrate the athleticism of it and just that like, oh my, shock factor of, someone going down this huge wave. And then for, several weeks after, they'd feel normal. And
So
then it
they'd
would
be
drop.
riding that high.
Yeah. I notice this a lot. So Boulder is a culture of like endurance athletes. People
Yeah.
love endurance sports, which are great. And, a lot of times when I dig into their stories, I find trauma, or I find a baseline of depression, or I find a real struggle with anxiety, or a real struggle to know who they are. And sort of the machinations of training and getting it going, that pushes different pathways.
Sure. You're looking right at me. No,
Yeah.
I'm
Right.
Well, no, as you're saying this, it's so funny because I observe myself all the time, and I observe people all the time. And I know that's something that you love too, just stories and people. And of course, I can't be objective with my own story, but I do like observe myself and see some of these patterns that I wonder about some of my behaviors. And one of the things that I do constantly is put too much on my plate, and I like to rush it, where I have, like, okay, so you were coming over for the podcast, and I got in my workout. I did this, I did that. I was like to the last second of it, knowing, all right, and like that rush, I get a rush from doing that. So that's something that I've done my whole life that's really interesting to think about, that it's doing something to my brain. I'm
Totally.
not giving myself 30 minutes before you came to just chill and relax. Oh no, I'm rushing it to the second, writing your bio.
Or
Like,
every time we go on a trip, the last 4 hours before we leave, it's just like nonstop chaos.
Yeah.
we live in chaos before we go on a vacation. It's really,
We
but
gotta
I'm like,
pack, we gotta
yes,
clean, we gotta
clean the
set
floor.
cats
Come
up.
on, let's go. Like adrenaline
Totally,
surging through my
totally.
body.
Well, this is an interesting thing. And you had that Gabor Mate book on your desk, and I really like his perspective on attention deficit disorder.
Okay.
Okay, just so may I respond to
I
what you
would
just
love,
said?
yeah, I would love that.
So I believe, for the most part, what we label as the behavioral continuum of attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactive disorder is really the byproduct of trauma to some degree. Not always, and it's not always explicit, and that intergenerational trauma can play a big role in this. So let me just start with that. But the ADD brain thrives on sort of that controlled chaos. And people with quote unquote ADD and ADHD, and this is by no means to diminish, the testing that goes on and the professionals who deal with that in really skillful ways. I don't always agree with the treatment needs to be an adrenaline medication. And we can get into that later, because when you start to understand brain types and personality types, unless someone's truly adrenaline deficient, giving them a medicine that's already pumping, a hyper-aroused system is actually not really awesome for the brain. It doesn't really change the needle. Point being, though, it makes sense if one has that milieu inside of their brain where there's not real coherent brain waves, different parts of the brain aren't talking easily to each other. There's a little dysregulation in the body that, riding the high of that chaos, squirts out a little, norepinephrine, a little bit of cortisol, a little adrenaline, and then, hey, get the dopamine. And then it's like, it feels normal.
Yeah, it's why I love to sprint to like the beat drop in music. That high I get.
That's right.
When the beat drops and I sprint
I
all
love the
out.
beat drop.
I love that.
I love the beat drop. I even said to my son the other night, wait for the drop. And he's like, what do you mean? I'm 7 years old. Like, you'll know when you feel it.
Yeah.
Totally. And here's the gift of trauma. Here's the gift of the resilient side of that is, look at all the stuff you've done. Look at all the people you've helped. Look at your own expression of physical health. I mean, it's amazing. If someone's just like, yeah, I feel really complete today. I think we're just going to stay on the couch. There's a certain level where they're not accessing that need to grow, and a healthy emergence of the need to be significant.
Yeah, I think that trauma doesn't have to be this big bad wolf.
Not
I
at
think
all.
it's painted as that a lot, but
That's right.
I used my trauma in a way for growth. And, I've had post-traumatic growth instead of post-traumatic stress in a lot of ways.
And all that's predicated, in my opinion, from my perspective, on a nervous system that can self-regulate. Because it can only convert to resilience with a nervous system that can self-regulate to some degree in an ever-growing fashion. Because otherwise, then the loops, these trauma loops, which we could say have a neurological correlate, every single one of them has a biological correlate, a chemical correlate, and then a neural structure. So until there's regulation with awareness, i.e. the ability to be self-aware and be in our frontal cortex, not in amygdala land, it's hard to self-regulate enough. So you obviously have this ability, and have done a ton of work to step back and self-observe. And then in whatever way you do, to drop into methods or practices or experiences that start to shift. So here's a fascinating story. There was a guy who, did I respond to that? Do you feel like that there was a through line there? Or is there more there?
I have two things that I'm like, want to
bring those, because we
back.
can always talk about the South Carolina used car salesman.
Well, no, I'm just wondering for our listeners, as they're kind of reflecting on their own behaviors and things, and how one might be able to understand what is leading the way. We talk about all of these chemicals, but we have no way of knowing exactly. Like, I can't tell you what my levels of neuroepinephrine are right now, currently, or what my serotonin is doing, right? I remember when
Hmm.
I was 16 doing some sort of test for this,
Hmm.
and this was coming off of my dad had just died. I was in
Hmm.
having panic attacks. I was in full disassociation, derealization, like a
Hmm.
crazy 2-week episode where I was just mentally unwell. And
Hmm.
it's like, well, my dad just died and I became an orphan and didn't, my life was changed
Hmm.
overnight kind of situation.
That's big T trauma
Yeah,
stuff.
big
Yeah,
T
it's
trauma.
huge.
And
Yeah.
I coped in the way I was coping. My brain had to do what it
And you
had
were
to do.
16, right?
16,
Yeah.
yeah. And so I remember getting those levels tested, which I can't tell you how they were tested. And I don't, back then, 2005, but it showed GABA, epinephrine, serotonin, dopamine. It showed what that was. But that's also this
Was it a
snap
urine test?
might have been, but it's a snapshot, right? Because
It's a-
aren't we changing all the
yeah.
time? And that's hard with like all these
100%.
tests that people want to get because people want this certainty right now.
That's right.
Functional medicine and naturopathic medicine is huge right now for people because they're
Mhm.
not getting what their needs met through just a regular primary care doctor. And there's so many more kind of funky issues that are popping up for people
Totally.
with chronic pain or gut stuff or brain fog. I mean, the list goes on with
Autoimmune.
autoimmune stuff. I hear stuff
Totally.
every day from clients
Every day.
about things that are going on
It's way worse than it
health-wise.
used to be.
Yeah.
So if I'm hearing what you said, originally is, well, what kind of drives this process? And then thank you for that vignette about your story. And I feel like, we've talked about that before, but it's really good to hear it again. And the question is, if I'm here, the sort of the essence, the spirit of your question is, well, what do we do with this? Where does it start? What drives this process? Did I hear you correct?
What drives this process, but how would one know what is going on with them chemically to be able to sort it? Or maybe do we not need to know that information exactly? Because how can
That's a
we
great
really know
question.
it?
I can speak to that on a few levels. So the bottom line with neurotransmitter testing, you can't. The Braverman Index is actually a really good way to do it with a health professional who knows how to read those things. It's pretty good. The urine tests, they're not very reliable. And other than that, we don't really have good neurotransmitter testing. There's, I don't mean this in a disparaging way. There's fringier testing that can look at that stuff. But is it reliable? Is it reproducible? No. And does the emphasis then on, okay, what's the thing? Does that help clients? So if I find the thing on a lab test, is that the thing? Because we love to find out what the thing is. Why?
Yeah.
Because we have a need for certainty. Like, I want to know why I feel like shit. Like, I want to know why, I have this autoimmune issue or chronic Lyme or chronic pain or whatever, or chronic depression, whatever it is. I want to know the thing. And labs, the advent of functional labs have been amazing. And I love them. And I've gone through the training at a functional medicine institute, and I love that stuff. The spirit of it is right on. And just because there's the presence of something on a lab doesn't mean that it's the thing. And there's two ways that can go south, and people get very obsessed then about fixing the thing. But what those tests aren't measuring, who is the person that has said thing? What is their life experience? How did they learn to cope and adapt? How did their nervous system get in overdrive? Because it's very possible someone could walk around with Lyme, but their immune system literally has it under control and their nervous system is regulated. They never have symptoms and they never have any deleterious effects from it. Same with Epstein-Barr, same with any of the PET diagnoses that come around. At the same time, not to diminish that work, focusing on those things can be life-changing for people who need that. But doing it to the exclusion of ignoring the milieu of the nervous system,
Mm-hmm.
it can be tough. And if people can't have good tools to regulate their nervous system, they can take their $500 to $700 of supplements every month and they won't do the trick. I can tell you a really cool story about this. So I had this one mentor, his name is Dietrich Klinghardt. You can look him up. And so he was really a father of biological medicine. He was a German physician, super holistic. Really, I think put the Lyme disease treatment on the map. But he always said, Lyme disease is connected to heavy metals and unresolved infections. heavy metals and unresolved infections are going to be connected to unprocessed, unhealed trauma. And he shared this example, and it's always stuck with me. And I've seen this play out so many times. In fact, I just had a woman yesterday who's this amazing, epic person. Her husband is extraordinarily well known in his field. I don't even want to say what field it is. So he shared this story, and then I'll share a little bit about hers. He had this patient, and he was doing DMPS injections. So these are chelating agents, right? Like DMPS, EDTA. These are things that bind up heavy metals
Yeah.
so that you can poop them out or pee them out or sweat them out, right? And I guess breathing out. Those are our 4 main pathways of detox, right? And so anyway, he's like, I know this woman has heavy metals because it was tested. What the test was, I'm not sure. I'm going to probably say it was probably a
I think they
combination.
do hair,
Hair or a
um,
provoked test.
blood, maybe, because I have some metal in my mouth, and that was suggested to me to just see if I have,
In my opinion, blood is not the best way to do
yeah,
that. You do a provoked test. I mean, the gold standard is you put in a chelating agent, you
Got
measure
it.
someone's urine, and then we say, oh, wow, there's a lot of mercury
Maybe it
there.
was urine. It would have been urine and hair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are the two kind of ways, and they're
Mhm.
both pretty good. So anyway, there was, and I don't exactly know what it was, so just so you know, I can't remember this, but there was objective proof that this woman was highly toxic with mercury and had health problems associated with all the chronic things.
Yeah.
And would inject her with DMPS and nothing would come out. That's weird. So she did constellation therapy. I don't know if you guys are familiar with
Just
this.
had a podcast with a constellation practitioner.
Great. So refer to the constellation therapy. It's amazing work. It's so amazing on so many levels because it's nervous system regulating, but it's also working in this mysterious realm of psyche and soul, which is hard to put our finger on. Sometimes hard to measure those things, but to me, they're totally real. So she has this gigantic breakthrough experience. And please watch the constellation therapy because I'm not a constellation therapist. So if I get this wrong, refer to the other podcast. But basically, the patient or the client, brings up their story, and the people in attendance, it's a group process, will assume then into the roles. You'll be the mother, you'll be the sister, you'll be the brother. And intuitively, this environment is created whereby there's basically, to me, from my vantage point, a safe reprocessing of a trauma in a safe way where there's unconditional positive regard. So it's almost like exposure therapy, like in this safe context that has this biopsychosocial neurological effect. So anyway, this woman does that, has this huge experience. And remember, profound experience is what really changes the brain.
Mhm.
That's what changes the brain. So that's why this kind of thing would be so impactful, because it can really change the structures of the brain and the emotional experience, and therefore the neurochemical experience. So she does this. She has incredible insight, profound. Next day, tons of mercury. Next day, tons of mercury. And then the amelioration of those symptoms. She got well, not because of treating the heavy metals. She got well by finishing the unfinished business. The trauma that was the ghost in the machine, that her body didn't even feel safe to let go of the mercury. It's like,
Wow.
here's another story. Like someone, I get chills thinking about this story. There was a woman whose biggest thing was weight. Now listen, I'm super body positive. I want you to feel good in the skin that you're in. But this was obesity, and it's a health crisis, and it was making everything bad. And she wanted to lose weight, but couldn't. And even let me pause there and say that the whole adverse childhood event study, you guys heard of this? The ACEs
Yeah, the
study?
ACEs study, which I took the ACEs test
Yeah.
as part of your trauma workshop
Yeah.
that you held. And I think it's a really powerful test. And I was going to include it into my client intake moving forward, because
It's so
as someone who
powerful,
works
right?
with bodies, I have found over the years that so much of what holds people back, they can be doing the right diet, they can be doing all of the quote unquote right things to have their body see a result,
Yeah.
and nothing.
Yeah.
And it's like this holding on
That's
to
it.
wait.
That's it. And I felt myself get overexcited and a little ADD there a second ago. So let me finish the woman's story, and then we'll talk about ACEs. But because it's a good client study and it really summarizes this point. Here's a person who done all the things. She'd worked with a diet, and I love dietitians. I love nutritionists. I love functional medicine people. I love naturopaths. I like all of our roles. Nothing was moving the needle. It wasn't paleo. It wasn't keto. It wasn't vegan. All of the things that people can do that in our culture, we love to make the thing. And then of course I say, well, I've got a financial interest to like really be an evangelist for the thing, or the thing really helped me, right? So in her case, nothing had worked. And so in my experience in working with her and getting down to the story, and I was using my system, quantum neuro reset therapy, I was like, wow, what happened to you? By the way, which is a great title of a book, is about trauma. What happened to
Who
you?
wrote that book?
It was Oprah Winfrey
Yes,
and the
that's right.
Chicago-based psychiatrist who's
That's right.
epic.
That's an Oprah book.
Yeah.
And
So
she
what
had a
happened to you with this?
docu-series about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's amazing. It's an
Mhm.
amazing book, and the stories in there are great. So what happened to you when you were 11? Because your body's telling me, based on the work I do, that there was a substantial trauma, and I see it affecting the cerebellum, because I always talk about the brain lobes, cerebellum, but it's showing up around your heart. And it has to do with a male figure. What happened to you? And then I just zip it and listen. Because sometimes that lands. No, I don't remember. This one was, that's when I started to be abused by my brother.
Mm.
And that's when I realized, and wait for it, because the language is where the medicine is. Thin was visible. So her subconscious mind says, sister, thin is visible. I'm not letting you lose this weight. In his book, Bruce Lipton, and in his book, The Biology of Belief, Bruce Lipton, PhD, sort of the granddaddy of epigenetics, said, and he had this quote in this book, the mind, which he meant the subconscious brain, and when I say that, that's not something woo-woo. It's really sort of the midbrain and the limbic system, these very primitive structures that are the volume control in all of our body's processes. I mean, that literally is command central. So that's the primacy of the nervous system right there. He said, the mind will adjust the body's physiology to be in alignment with subconscious beliefs. So in this case, her subconscious belief was, meaning it was no longer conscious, this was survival. She needed this to be certain. And to have autonomy of her body is, I need this cushion.
Yeah.
Got to that, reprocessed the trauma in a couple ways. By the way, I don't operate as a one-man show. My wife's a therapist, so there were other people involved in this. Anyway, after a period of, maybe let's say 6 months, she had really the body she had always wanted. And by every, BMI metric, good. But I didn't care so much about that, except that someone can say, I finally feel like I'm at home in my body.
Mm-hmm.
I finally feel like I can feel my feet on the ground, and I've never been more connected, and now was no longer an unconscious slave to this reactive pattern, this driver inside that's like a reflex that's literally running her life. And not only was it ruining her health, blocking any kind of truly meaningful relationship.
What was happening there, though? Was she sabotaging herself? Because you're saying like someone like that is doing all the right things. They're doing the paleo. They're trying all of these diets or whatever that should work. Was she still somehow over consuming food because
This is a good segue
you know what I
into
mean?
the
The
ACEs
brain
study.
was saying like
Yeah.
don't lose weight. So in some ways she's still doing behaviors
it.
that wouldn't allow her
Is it a
body to lose
behavioral
weight.
thing? Here was my observation of that particular thing, and then this leads well into the ACEs study. I think two things happen. One is I just think your physiology won't work right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, and as we know, like weight loss for some people is highly complex. We have a very complex hormonal system, down into more granular things like leptin and ghrelin and, the reward system and serotonin and dopamine and insulin. It just can get very complex. I think she was just in such a state of trauma, her body didn't work right.
Yeah.
So there was no matter what she did, because behaviorally, there were times when she did the right thing and nothing happened, probably because cortisol, insulin, leptin, ghrelin, all those signaling systems were so off.
Well, I find that I've had experience with people where they love to put the blame on the metabolism, cortisol, all of these hormones, and that is a way to feel
Avoid.
to avoid, but or they don't know though. When we're talking about this trauma's complex, this nervous system health isn't just overnight you are a transformed individual who's
Definitely
had,
not.
this embodied experience like you're sharing, and it requires something of somebody. It requires you to show up and deal with your shit in
That's
a
it.
way
And that's
that
hard. That's
isn't
really
that's
hard.
that's hard as fuck.
And the reward is not, it's not like
It's
the
not,
one
and
hit wonders never last.
well, and it's also not something that somebody necessarily will be able to do. Not that you can't do this on your own. You absolutely, of course, can take yourself through your own process if you'd like, but that requires too
Yeah,
an
it's hard. You have to know a
understanding
lot
and
of things.
some
And
skill, and you have to
yeah,
find the right practitioner to lead you through something that
yeah,
will allow you to have an embodied experience. And I want to pivot a little bit because we don't have all the time in the world, and I would do
cool.
like 4 hours with you, Matt. Because
Can I just say one quick
yes,
thing?
please,
So was she self-sabotaging?
yes.
I would reframe that as when she felt disappointed that her body didn't seem to do what she wanted, but wasn't aware of this top-down process.
Mhm.
She self-sabotaged. Plus, that was a way to self-medicate because food is love for her. There was an orientation around that. So I just paused there, and I'd say the whole birth of the ACEs study came out of understanding why people would do epic gains in their weight loss and then relapse. And that's what's the observation was, oh my God, they've all been abused as kids.
This is the
And that's
adverse
what happened.
childhood event
That was
study.
the birth of the ACEs research,
Mhm.
where then they studied 18,000 something people in a big database over a 40-year period and said, oh my God, everybody with chronic health with an ACEs score over 4, and every, like, it's a 10-point score, anything over 4, meaning there were 4 major traumatic events in a person's life or processes, it doesn't have to be a singular event. That was a smoking gun cause and effect trigger of all the main chronic diseases that we know of. Thus saying trauma is a major public health issue. So if we don't finish our unfinished business, and in that context, whether it's on our own or finding a team of people who can help us to re-regulate and repattern that, it's tough in chronic health. And even for those of us that are high performers or high functioners, it's hard to ever feel really whole and to express the fullness of what a human's potential is. Compassion, love, empathy, parenting, growing a business, having a bigger audience, from a place where you stay really well and whole the whole time. So anyway, we can pivot, but I just wanted to
yeah,
add
and
that
then
piece
I'm
in.
thinking, with all of these quote unquote spiritual gurus that are out there
Whew.
that are leading movements,
Here we go. Yeah.
of people to become whole. When you go to the top, oftentimes after a while, there's something that happens with these people, which is they become sexual predators. There's things that come out, and I'm generalizing. This is not every single person that's leading a wellness movement, but it's interesting to
Mm.
see. And that, like, what I'm thinking is, if you don't heal your shit, stuff like that's going to happen, because this, like you said, in the hierarchy of needs, or Tony Robbins 6, what is
The
it called?
6 human needs.
6 human
Yeah.
needs,
Which he didn't develop. He just teaches that.
but one of them was significance.
Yeah.
And so things can get out of control with feeling significant and powerful and whatnot
100%.
in these settings. But as far as,
Was there a question in there?
there's a question in here, which is, where do people start with creating a more wholeness for themselves? And like you said earlier, there's so many practitioners and different
Mm.
wellness avenues that you can take. But if somebody's thinking, gosh, I don't feel great, I'm depressed, I'm anxious,
Hmm.
it's a milieu of things. I
Yeah.
don't feel like I'm my optimal self,
Totally.
right?
I'm hurting.
I'm hurting.
Yeah. I feel like shit. I'm
I
hurting.
feel like
Yeah.
shit. Where would one
I'm
begin
disconnected.
to
I want more out of my life.
where would
I
one
feel
begin
stuck.
to connect
Yeah.
to get out of that a little bit?
That's a great question. It from the I want to answer the question very directly, and I'm not trying to avoid it, and nor am I trying to speak from a woo-woo place. But really is to drop in and say, what's really going on? What is really going on with me, and what is happening in my life? What do I want, and what have I been through? Because just looking at that real simply says, all right, cool. Because once we can kind of look, and just even with that, we don't know what to name it, like, whoa, I am aware that I am hurting. that I have a low grade or high grade anxiety that is affecting my life, I feel like shit. I've thought about killing myself twice in a month. I can't keep relationships. Like I screw up money, like I'm really good with my can't. So just naming the issue and saying, this hurts and I feel this in my body and I'm starting to see a pattern, that's really important. And I think just the willingness to ask for, like before anything happens, just the willingness to be honest and say, my human experience is hard and I cannot figure this out. When we look at the 12 steps are controversial in terms of their efficacy and, recidivism rates and recovery. I happen to love them. The power of them, which is also the power of so many great perennial wisdom systems, is shit, I'm out of answers and I'm stuck. That's a good place to start. Okay. After that, depending on if you've had trauma, is to search out people who are really trauma informed, which, believe it or not, it's actually a thing. Like I've gone through a lot of training. And so to find people who are really trauma informed in the psychotherapy world, there's lots of good options. I really, for some people, like EMDR, not everybody. I really like neurofeedback for some people, not everybody. I love somatic experiencing. All those disciplines are very trauma informed. Internal family systems, IFS, parts work, Dick Schwartz work, amazing. So in the psychology world, I really like that.
Mm-hmm.
In the body work world, there's then a lot of different options. In my profession, most people aren't trauma informed. And I mean that with no disrespect to my profession. They tend to see through a lens of like, hey, the structure of your body is the reality. So just let me kind of put my trip on you. And I would say that by and large, the same goes for physical therapy. Having said that, both of our professions have these nuggets where people can really help from a bottoms up perspective, which is to say from the body back up to the brain, provide really meaningful tools to help re-regulate the nervous system. So for me, I use neuro-emotional technique. I use a polyvagal approach to chiropractic. So I have a very polyvagal trauma-informed way. I understand how to stimulate the vagus nerve while in a very safe way, bringing the nervous system's awareness of trauma up. And then, of course, quantum neuro reset therapy is all based on repatterning the brain with trauma.
There's a lot of fear that comes up for people with
yeah,
going into their trauma.
totally.
And
As kind of there should be.
And avoidance that is around this because of that. Like,
Which
you know
is
what?
a biological thing because the
I'll-
body says this isn't
Yeah,
safe.
I'll deal with that later. I
Yeah.
can't handle that right now. Right now, I'm just trying to, my work is crazy. My kids, there's so much responsibility.
That's right.
I know that I'm hurting and that I'm suffering, but that over there, that pink elephant
Totally.
in the corner,
I want to put that in the back of my mind.
I can't, I'm afraid. I'm
That's
afraid to go there. In my experience, it's worth it, but you have to be in a safe environment with the
That's
right
it.
practitioner,
That's that
and you have to build
trauma-informed
rapport. You said you
perspective.
build rapport with your
Yeah.
clients. Each should be, I'm not saying should, because everybody is different, but for me, it has to go slow. I am someone that dips this is me in an ice bath. I put my legs into the ice bath, I get out. Then I put my torso into the ice bath and I get out. Seriously, this is my process. Then I can put my fucking shoulders into the ice bath and then I can go into the ice bath a bunch of times. But this is how I operate with anything that's going to be really jarring to the nervous system, because I grew up with a really unsafe perspective of my environment around me. So there's lingering things that just like, I always feel like I'm going to die.
Totally.
So I've had to really learn how to build trust and know I'm not going to die.
This is a really good point, because safety is the key. The vagus nerve, your nervous system is looking for safety 4 times per second. So if, regardless of the tradition or the discipline, anything that doesn't really understand safety, which isn't, new age music and the lighting of the room, it's actually creating safety for people, they will not heal. And it can actually be re-traumatizing. So you talked about, let's just call it the various players within the healing movement or the self movement, whether that's plant medicine or, sort of demigods of new age spirituality or the healing world.
Lots of breath work now.
Lots of breath work.
Yes.
Deep meditate, all the things. If they are trauma informed, which is to say the facilitator in the group can really engender and create a milieu of safety, I say run the other direction. And to the degree that you sense hubris, or, and we throw the word narcissism around like a lot, and I'm guilty of this, but when things have that flavor of narcissism or
This is the
demigods,
best practice that exists in the
totally,
world.
or you feel like you're being pulled into something that feels a little bit culty, you just trust your vibes. I know that sounds like really simplistic, but you're better off going slow to go fast, is it? And you listen, and the brain relies on, is it Hibb's law or Hebb's law? It's this slow training process over time in our nervous system that creates the best results. And that's why I think such an integrative approach of movement, working with you, nutrition, some therapy of some type, if it works for you, body practices where you may say like, you know what, I've got trauma, but I don't want to go there with a therapist yet. There's really good, cool, like yoga classes, trauma-informed yoga practice. There's apps where you can like dip your toe in the water. Wasn't curable was the way. It was a way where people with chronic pain that was in the brain that probably had traumatic roots can use an app to dip their toe in the water and start to change their brain. But safety is key. Literally, it's what the vagus nerve is all about. That's its evolutionary imperative. Because if I'm not safe, I'm not going to like continue the species. So it's really important. And the nervous system simply won't heal. You can't get out of the amygdala and into the frontal cortex without safety.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really good point you bring up.
Yeah.
And I think that can be the challenge is they say, okay, well, let me do all the things, right? Let me do all. So here's the other extreme.
I'm looking at my notes. I'm not ignoring you. I just want to make sure that if there's anything that I'm like dying to know that I
Okay.
wrote down.
Do you mind if I finish
Yes,
this?
of course,
Because
please.
then the other
Please,
extreme, and you
please do.
see this in Boulder here, is let me do everything. I see the
Yeah.
acupuncturist. I take my herbs. I go to the naturopath. I go to the chiropractor. I see the shaman in Brazil or Costa Rica, and I'm doing ayahuasca. I'm in ketamine therapy. I see a psychic who channels Archangel Johnny, and she also taps into the Akashic records, and I'm meditating 2 hours a day, and I work out obsessively. That's beating the drum of the problem because it's based on a fundamental perception that I'm fucked up. And everything that I'm doing now is feeding that. Like I shared in these other vignettes, if the unfinished business of the system isn't safely brought forth, man, you can throw everything at the blocks. But the human ego, here we get a little maybe like slightly more metaphysical. The human ego is just all about maintaining its own identity and its own significance. And so then those become the traps. And now I'm in those things as the fix. But what people, then we miss the heart. So you have these two extremes of like, let me avoid or let me overdo. And the sweet spot is a loving, compassionate, embodied, overall perspective that says, I'm worthy of healing. I've got some stuff. And if I can trust my intuition, will be led to the right people. And then I can discern based on their credentials and trainings if they're legit. And then I can meet with them and have discernment if this is a good fit. And if it feels like a sales pitch, a used car salesman thing, if you feel hooked into a big thing, it's just good to step away. And I'd say the same goes for the various players in the industry who are big influencers and have a big platform and stage. Because I've seen enough in my world to get to look behind the curtain of some very notable folks. And it's not that I'm without my own challenges, but there is such a demand for the highest level of integrity when you are stewarding the health and well-being of people. And you've written books and you're on a big stage. The integrity has to be there to create safety. And I think we really need humility-based leadership in these worlds, where it's less of this top-down patriarchal model and a little bit more of a communal base where we may have experts, but it's really based on a co-creative collective ecosystem. I'm sort of done with gurus.
Mm-hmm.
Not that there's not amazing teachers,
Yeah.
but the most amazing teachers I know are like, hey, this is the thing I'm good at. This is what I teach. I'm human just like you. Let's walk together on the path. Here's a bridge. There's your future self shining back at you. Here's where we are now. Here's a bridge. I can help you on this bridge, probably with some other people, but your uncompromising willingness and desire to embody the highest perspective of you, that's the most healing thing we can do.
Yeah.
I
also think that people want that promise that's often offered to them with some of these bigger
That's it.
teachers, which
They
is
project their golden shadow.
they promise that you will have complete transformation and that your life will be, unrecognizable for the better and that you'll be able to manifest anything that you could have ever wanted and desired.
Yeah.
And
It's
the
a
reality of
it's a
that,
slippery area, isn't
it's
it?
kind of depressing when you go do these things and then you're like, well, my life didn't get any better. I obviously it can't manifest because it didn't happen. And I still feel like shit.
That's the thing is the big picture for me is to what degree, let's just say, I don't know what to call that thing. Let's just say that ecosystem of powerful, charismatic leader with the assurance of if you do these teachings, you will arrive or you will heal or you will manifest. Because we are meaning-making machines. And one of our highest needs, according to Abraham Maslow, is to belong. And everybody wants to feel like they can connect and be part of a tribe and have hope. Like if people can't make progress, that is the recipe for despair. So I see where the draw comes. But when you get the confluence of Eastern spirituality meets landmark Werner Erhard Est, meets American capitalism, meets the emptiness that so many Americans feel in a very materialist culture, where we're effective orphans from our connection to nature and to each other who live on devices, it's very easy to get sucked into this. And I've seen very few of them work well. Nay, I would argue I've never seen one of them really deliver. And the bottom line is that from my perspective, either going to these things or just witnessing, is that the amount of recidivism was very high, meaning people could have these big experiences because our dopamine is high and my oxytocin is high because I'm liking this experience.
Oh, I've walked away from those experiences like whole new perspective on life. I'm enlightened right now.
Yeah, dog. And the second law of thermodynamics is entropy. So without consistent, steady, safe work, those states are states. They don't translate to a better stage of neurological development, of psychological development. And that's a huge thing people miss, is that you can have a big state shift, whether it's from ayahuasca or psilocybin or MDMA or a rave, or I'm going on a cruise to watch this band, or I'm going to this person's big 6-day retreat, or we're going to meditate for 10 hours a day and gaze into each other's eyes and create a new self and download a new timeline and like embody the sacred geometry of everything. The challenge is all that may be useful to a degree, but unless that state is translated into a stage, a meaningful new perspective of the world that now engenders different behaviors, different attitudes, different perspectives from a very different altitude, it's all for naught. And at worst, it feeds a sense of that I'm broken and now I need the hit of that. Because what do? We do what we do to make our brain feel better. Worse, it feeds this sort of self-absorption narcissism that then is the biggest avoidance to the actual hurt inside, which is I feel fucking vulnerable and I don't know what to do with this. And doing the work to really work with that is hard and it takes time and nobody has the perfect match. But I do think there's enough resources in this day and age where anybody can get better and find their tribe in an organic way. That's something I'm extremely passionate about. Especially having, myself given way too much time, energy, and money to a couple of cultic systems when I was looking for healing in all the wrong places. I got sucked in.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand, I had my own vulnerabilities and I don't want to speak for everybody, but my clinically informed perspective, having gone through much of my own trauma healing, has allowed me to say, I think most people, if they dabble in that stuff, get the tools, do the work. See what lands, move on. The minute you're magnetized like a moth to a flame, just remember the moth is attracted to a flame, which is going to burn its ass up.
And you're saying do the work. That's a big umbrella for whatever that is for you. But then I think you and I spoke about this, that some people get really obsessed with I'm doing the work.
Totally. And that becomes the next distraction. So it is this sweet spot.
And it is kind of narcissistic, and that's challenging for me when I'm speaking to some people who are in this kind of spiritual healing world where, and this is why my old podcast, the one that we originally started, was called the Woo Cast.
That's right.
And I became really disillusioned and I became so withdrawn because I was just chatting with many incredible people too, but I just was going, it wasn't even the people on the podcast, actually. It was more me going down this road of healing and spirituality. I was going so deep and I was like, where am I? Am I on earth? What's going on? There's people who are speaking light language and doing all these things, and I'm just not sure
There's quite a
what
plethora of things out there, aren't
what is
there?
happening
And
right
is it
now.
real?
I know here I am, like I'm gonna go to Costco,
Yeah.
like, and live my life.
The Occam's razor was this mathematical theorem. It basically says the simplest answer, that's the right one most of the
This
time.
is what Mackie tells me all the time is his answer to all my problems.
So in this world, meaning the stuff we're talking about, the simplest answer is the right one. You know what's real? Is connection, is human connection. Yeah. We know scientifically that heals. Safely reprocessing trauma through whatever means, we know scientifically that heals. We know trauma can be dense inside your body, even if it was 5 generations back. But according to the research on intergenerational trauma, doing the work, which by the way, I do not associate with narcissistic, self-consuming navel gazing all the time with all the things, with all the different molecules. I don't think that's the work. Why do I say that? Because 20 plus years of doing this, having met with a number of people who've done all the things, who then, even leaders of said programs, who disclose, wow, when the doors close, I feel really empty and vulnerable inside. Wow, that trauma pattern is still there. Wow, I can't hold my marriage together, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what I do see is the slow movement, the slow organic titration of endeavoring to express the highest virtue of myself I can, just getting 1% better per day. Atomic Habits, if you want to read the math of that, right?
My favorite.
That's right.
Yeah.
That slow, steady titration that's based in the perennial wisdom values of love, compassion, perseverance, integrity, humility. Those things work. And there are systems that I think are very aligned in there. But for the most of it, at this point in my career, I'm like, I'm not interested. And you know what? If you can't show me changes on an EEG demonstrably, I don't really, and this, I'm trying to be a dick. I actually am not interested so much in your methodology if we can't objectively say, wow, this really moved the needle in some objective test and some intersubjective thing where the person is demonstrably actualizing greater degrees of psychological wholeness. Not as a moral judgment, but like, are you more psychologically whole? And do your behaviors check that? And if I talk to your kids and your wife, what are they going to tell me? Mm-hmm. And not what your social media feed tells me. Like, who are you really when the door is closed? When nobody's looking, and in the deepest recesses of your mind, what drives you? Is it a hunger for service and love and growth and contribution? That really lights me up. Methodologies that really change people's brain coherence, whether we measure that through a EEG or SPECT scan or functional MRI, or it really just measurably changed people at their root, at this operational system root.
Yeah, I love all this that you're sharing. I think this is it's good for people to have discernment when it comes to when they're looking into different practices and methodologies. And also to ask themselves, like, has it really moved the needle for me? Have I felt, there's no reason to continue doing something if you aren't receiving the change that you were looking for. And something Mackie and I had a conversation recently about marketing and branding. And this is something that people are going to be seeing coming up. We went from very much like this farm to table, like feeling like very hyper local branding, and people getting excited about that, and that would make them feel like, okay, like this meat is from next door, so
right,
it's great. Meanwhile, the cow might have actually just been shipped from like 3 states down. Who knows?
Well, I think if you go even one step beyond, before that was like the luxury brands, right? Like your Louis Vuittons and that kind of thing, and then from there it turned into the farm to table movement, and then
now the next movement that we've been told, which is really interesting, is the sacred movement. So
God, that makes sense. That is so true. You're right.
So
this is the movement.
Your cacao is going to be sacred.
My cacao is sacred.
It's going to be blessed by a shaman.
Yeah.
So it's just so interesting.
I facilitated a wedding. They had a woman come to a cacao ceremony, and as she stood up, she's like, I've traveled in India, like I've mastered the chakras, and I'm a sound healer. And, this cacao ceremony, what's fascinating is cacao as a food, as a quote unquote medicine, is purely from like Central America, Mexico, South America. So this weird confluence of all this mishmash of cultures in the sacred movement arouses a healthy suspicion in me, which says, just be discerning. And then when all this like branding and wording around and then the monetization of this now, it just makes me go, the simplest answer is usually the right one. I like old school wisdom. I love the woo, but I want to measure the results and I want to connect to what's real. And that stuff just so often becomes such a posturing and a mask that is worn that now actually decouples people from vulnerability and real relationship and can make trauma patterns worse, quite honestly. Not that cacao's bad. I really like cacao. And
It's one of my favorite. It's one of my favorite
I've had
foods.
some lovely cacao ceremonies where I really felt like, hey, this is
You
cool.
should see the chocolate I brought back from Costa Rica. I bought like
And-
10 bars back.
Yeah.
I love places that actually make chocolate.
That's right.
So
But the Akashic records, derived from the disincarnate embodied beings of Atlantis who gave this to me through my Akashic readings, through my cards and my Native American tradition, but I'm also a yoga teacher and I've done life coach training in this. That's where it gets a little jumbled, doesn't it?
it does.
Without accountability. And that's the challenge in a lot of this world is there's not professional accountability. And I get that. Coaching is kind of cool in a way where it's not under the guise of some auspice of a licensing board, but at the same time, then it's the Wild West.
It's real creative
Yeah.
out there. That's for sure. Mackie and I, one of the things that we bond over most is being interested in the potentiality of some of these things,
love
right?
that.
The
I'm just
potentiality
curious.
of the Akashic records. Like, what could that be? Or maybe there was a lost civilization that lives under the Bahamas, or but all of these things, we're curious. It's entertainment to watch YouTubes about this stuff or to listen to people on podcasts about it. But as far as it becoming my entire life, where I am now a starseed being that
you
is
are.
channeling.
That's it. You're a
From-
starseed with your twin flame.
This is my twin flame.
never yeah.
Did you see that documentary, by the way, on
No.
Netflix? Twin
No,
Flame.
I can't do it. I
You
don't want to
can't-
do it anymore.
Yeah, I hear you.
One of the great
You've been doing this a lot longer
Yeah.
than we have.
I have this wonderful teacher. He's a bona fide Zen master.
Yeah.
He's a really nice guy and this beautiful guy. And I love the simplicity of his perspectives. Matt, just sit, be quiet, follow your breath. I think that and this is not a Buddhist pitch by any stretch. I really like all the perennial traditions, but that idea that you can't get away from it. The Buddha's first teaching was life is suffering. I mean, it's fucking hard.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard.
Yeah. No matter how much cacao you drink or how much
That's it.
ayahuasca you do.
That's it. And
shit happens.
And the narrative of those four, the end of the story is hey, this is going to be fucking hard. But listen, there is a way to be a whole person. Now, he described it as that eightfold path, which is sort of a map, right? Like right speech, right conduct, basically just be a good whole integrated person. They didn't have the psychological trauma-informed insights we have, but it's a really simple approach. And it's really interesting when you look at the research on mindfulness and mindfulness-based therapy that was born of that tradition. God damn, that shit works really good.
It does. That's
Yeah.
all, and I agree with you.
When
It's
you look at
simple,
the
beautiful.
virtue life, Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life is basically a look at really good living that's based on sort of the classical virtue-based life. Shit, when you put that up against research, that stuff really works. And yet they're so rich and deep.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something substantial there. There's an essence of something that we know feels true. And I think that's my thirst and my quest, because I've deceived myself at times in my life. I felt really alone. I felt really disconnected. And then I've gone through a path where I feel like I've really found a wholeness in my heart. Doesn't mean I'm perfect, but I feel so whole and I'm so in love with people to a degree that I can be in a healthy way, because I have an unconditional positive regard that humans can heal. It's demonstrably true. The great perennial wisdoms have shown us this. And just lighten the fuck up. 1% per day. My grandmother used to tell me, the one I told you who worked with alcoholics, she'd say, Matt, kiss, baby, kiss. I'd be like, what is that, Grandma? Keep it simple, stupid. I was like, oh yeah. So, truth is true.
Yeah.
It always is. Humans love a complex, shiny story. But, it's a mystical law that where there's, to be skeptical of the spectacle. So whenever I see spectacle and flashy lights and glowy-eyed people saying this is the next thing, I say, okay, cool. Who are you? What's your experience? How is this helping you? What drives you? What is your pain? What happened to you? And then I get into what's there and I find out what are you really looking for? And then again, the story becomes really simple for me.
Beautiful. Where can people find you? What are you
Right
what are
now?
you doing? What are you up to?
At your home.
Yes.
You can go to my website, livityhealing.com. It kind of has all my stuff in terms of my clinical work. You can follow me on social, dr.mattlyon. That's really the best way to do it.
Awesome.
And you can always reach me from there.
We'll link it in the show notes for
Yeah.
people.
That's it. I have a workshop I'm doing on intergenerational trauma. April 10th. If you're in town, please come. Yeah, I love that. I'm so obsessed with the science of this intergenerational trauma and how it lives inside of us and how we shift it. Because, dude, we live in a traumatized world, with what's going on in the Middle East and all over. Just so many wars, so much stuff. You got Ukraine, you got Haiti now, you got this.
And you've got your own family lineage too.
And we got our own family lineage. You can really
Yeah.
shift this stuff. That's what the science tells us. So that's where you can find me.
Love it.
Here right now on the web.
On the
webs.
World Wide Web.
That's right.
www. You don't say dot anymore. livityhealing.com.
I love how Martha's been she's never done this with us before.
Mm.
She's into this conversation. Little
She
Miss
knows
Martha.
she knows I'm a feral cat myself.
They have a great energy to them, cats. They're really
Yeah.
cool.
I'm really a
Thanks,
furry. That's my main therapeutic approach,
that
and
what
I
you're doing?
identify as a cat.
Awesome.
Thanks,
All right.
guys, for having me.
Thank you.